Just a quick follow-up because I was watching the video back a while ago to see how bad the vacuum sound was on the previous video. Again, apologies for that. What I thought I'd do right quick is I mentioned sanding the edges down. So one thing I want to point out is usually what we do is take like 150, 220 sandpaper. And you get your little block. Now, you need to wear a mask when you're doing this. Very important because this dust is really nasty. Okay, I've got a vacuum over here. As soon as I get done with the sanding, I'm going to vacuum it all off out here in the shop before it goes back into the house because you really don't want to be breathing this stuff. But to sand down the little ridges that are formed, you would just go back and forth here, get it nice and flat. And then the other thing I want you to point out, it will leave a little bit of a matte surface, and if you want to, if that's a little too rough for your purposes, usually by the time we use primer or whatever on here, and maybe in the future we'll talk about what primers we use, because we use some expensive ones and then we use some fairly cheap ones. But they'll usually fill in all those sanding marks and you won't even notice them. If that bothers you, obviously just go in with a finer sandpaper. But again, if you're sanding plastic, please be very careful. Use a mask that's rated for very fine particulates, etc. Once you get this stuff in your lungs, it ain't coming out. The other thing I would point out is that on the die cutter, we didn't talk about the cutter head itself. The little blade actually doesn't turn, it's not mechanically turned by the printer. What happens is as it goes and it gets to a corner, it pivots. And at first I was really worried about would it round the corners off a lot. And as you can see, if you were to look, you can probably zoom in or whatever, there is a little bit of rounding. It is not much. The other thing I would point out here is that once you pop these out, since the cutter is a V shape as it's going down through the plastic, it's shaped like a knife, it's not going to be totally straight up and down on the edges. If that is a key concern of yours, then you probably want to do a little edge sanding while you're out here and vacuum that off as well before you go back in. Sometimes if it's really we find like a piece of plastic is a little bit harder, or maybe it just wasn't guiding quite right, you get a little bit more of a V edge going off on the side. Typically it'll be going in that direction towards the waste piece over here. Just take a little X-Acto knife and very carefully just trim it back to where it's parallel with the edge. Hit it, perpendicular to the little piece of sandpaper, and you're all good to go. Now, having said all that, the one last thing I would say is I'm saying goodbye to a very dear friend of mine. This is my Delta drill press. This was my first major piece of equipment I ever bought many decades ago. I won't say how many, but many. And she gave up the ghost. All the bearings and the shaft inside finally wore out. Everything just failed fantastically the other day. It wobbles extraordinarily badly. At this point, it's not safe to use. So after more than 3 decades of service, I'm saying goodbye to her. I'll keep the motor. She's still pretty good. But to replace her, this was a kind of an odd size. It was a 16.5-inch drill press. We're getting in a Jet 20-inch. It will have a little bit more quill travel than this one. That's really great for working on models. The really cool thing is that it's got a machine metalworking tabletop on it. So I'll be able to use the same hold downs and stuff that we use over on the mill. And then also getting a large 6-inch Wilton vise to go on there. It'll replace this one. This is actually not even mine. It's a good friend of mine. He's been kind enough to loan it to me for a couple of years out here. So that will be returning home after I clean it up. And the drill press, due to parts no longer being available, we will be saying goodbye to her. But she's been a good machine. This was back when Delta made really, really great tools. It was one of, I think, the American-made drills, or at least in Brazil at the time, before they started outsourcing things. But all good things must come to an end, but we start a new adventure with the new Jet 20-inch. Talk to y'all later.